When the chains were broken off, there came a new opportunity for Negroes to represent their new status as free people. And what better way to do so than to rename themselves, as some did? Let's delve into it by going into Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, and let's turn to page 247, where he writes this. Rather than reveal a sordid past, the names assumed or revealed after emancipation reflected a new beginning, an essential step toward achieving the self-respect, the personal dignity, and the independence which slavery had compromised. This is focusing on the personal name, but renaming oneself as a step toward self-respect, dignity, and independence also applies to the name used to represent a people. The European colonizers placed names on those that they conquered, and this was as a symbol of their rulership. So to throw off that name is one key to demonstrate that people no longer accept their rule, right? This goes for a group as it does for the personal level.
We hardly know our names,
recalled Sally Crane, a former Arkansas slave.
We was cussed for so many bitches and sons of bitches and bloody bitches and blood of bitches. We never heard our names scarcely at all.
Oh, snaps. Describing
the most cruel acts
inflicted upon him as a slave, William Wells Brown singled out the order that he dropped the name his mother had given him. The master had wished to placate his nephew, also named William, who had recently taken up residence on the plantation. The nephew didn't want Mr. Williams Wells Brown to have the same name as him. So the master wished to placate or appease his nephew by making Mr. William drop that name.
I received several very severe whippings for telling people that my name was William after orders were given to change it. Though young, I was old enough to place a high appreciation upon my name.
That's what they did to a lot of the originals from Africa. They used the whip to beat out their tribal names if they didn't willingly accept new names. This applied to the group name right on down to the personal, like they did Mr. William Wells Brown. Until his escape, he went by the name of Sanford, but the moment he reached a safe haven, he adopted his old name.
And let Sanford go by the board, for I always hated it. Not because there was anything peculiar in the name, but because it had been forced upon me.
It was the principle behind the thing. Not that Sanford was a funny name or anything like that. It was simply due to the fact that another human forced it on him. During slavery, many blacks only had a given name. Although most slaves appeared to have named their own children, the master might arbitrarily assign a name, borrowing heavily from classical, biblical, and simplified Anglo-Saxon appellations. The naming process also afforded him a chance to indulge in some humorous whims, and some did so at the expense of the slave's dignity. Masters might permit certain favorites and slaves who exercised authority over other slaves to adopt their own surnames, like the Negro drivers and overseers. The less privileged were apt to have the same surname as the master, a convenient way to identify the plantation to which they belonged. To allow the slave to use his own surname, Jacob Stroyer recalled,
would be sharing an honor which was due only to his master, and that would be too much for a Negro, said they, who was nothing more than a servant.
You see the games they played? They knew the secret of the name, and according to Jacob Stroyer, it was said to be too much for a Negro, who was nothing more than a servant.
So it was held as a crime for a slave to be caught using his own name, a crime which would expose him to severe punishment.
Numerous ex-slaves then, like Wash Ingram of Texas, recalled only that
we always went by the name of whoever we belonged to.
Speaking about the last names, more often than many masters realized, slaves adopted their own surnames.
When the white folks speak of them, they say John that belongs to Mr. So-and-so.
Robert Smalls testified during the war.
But among themselves they use their titles. Before their masters they do not speak of their titles at all.
Uh-oh, so you can see how these slaves understood the importance of a name. Plantation records rarely listed slaves by surnames, and the vast rice plantations owned by the Hayward family in South Carolina were no exception. Some of the more prominent blacks, however, like Old Blacksmith Caesar, were known by both their given names and their surnames, and
among themselves,
Duncan Clinch Hayward conceded,
the slaves all had surnames, and immediately after they were freed, these names came to light. The surnames were selected by the Negroes themselves, Scarcely ever did a Negro choose the name of his or her owner, but often took that of some other slave-holding family of which he knew.
Occasionally, surnames other than that of the master would surface beyond the confines of the slave quarters, much to the surprise of the white family.
Mammy, what makes you call Henry Mr. Ferguson?
Susan Dabney Smedes remembered asking her usually indulgent mammy, who had taken her to a slave wedding.
Do you think 'cause we are black that we can't have no names?
She replied indignantly. This stuff is wild, isn't it? Usually, however, such names were not publicly revealed until after emancipation. Not at all hesitant about adopting or revealing surnames were scores of ex-slaves who considered this step necessary to demonstrate and ensure their newly won freedom.
No man thought he was perfectly free.
The overseer on a Louisiana plantation observed,
Unless he had changed his name and taken a family name, precious few of them ever took that of their old masters.
this group of the enslaved knew better. It was an intuitive thing for them to do right after slavery. It may seem small to some people, but it has major psychological benefits. And throughout this period up to the 20th century, there were individuals who proposed to change the group name, but it was always suppressed by the leaders, right? And I take it that it just wasn't the right season for that, as it was for the personal names. If any doubts remained about the validity of emancipation, some freed slaves came up with the ingenious idea that a new name might be a useful device to retain their freedom and avoid re-enslavement.
When us black folks got set free,
Alice Wilkins recalled,
us and change our names. So if and the white folks get together and change their minds and don't let us be free anymore, then they have a hard time finding us.
hot. And you know it's hot too. Simple, and it makes sense. The notion that blacks marked their emancipation by repudiating their slave names distorts the significance those names had assumed for large numbers of slaves, particularly the ways in which they often reflected a deeply felt familial consciousness. Now Dr. Litwack is dealing with this name-changing event as something that's only applying to some former slaves, because there was a larger sector that did not get down with the name-changing thing. Although some freedmen quickly dropped the whimsical names their masters had bestowed on them, nearly everyone else retained his or her previous given name. And here's why. This had been their sole identity during bondage, often the only remaining link to parents from whom they had been separated and who had initially named them. No matter how harsh a bondage they had endured, few freed slaves revealed any desire to obliterate their entire past or family heritage, and those whose given names or surnames reflected kinship ties tended to guard them zealously. Some people felt that a major part of their identity was tied into their name, regardless if it was a slave name or not. These names connected them to their family, and they did not want to start over, so they decided to keep what they had. Many freedmen, on the other hand, adopted surnames for the first time, often choosing a name that would set them off as a discrete family. Some began to use openly the surnames they had assumed as slaves, and still others slightly altered their names to symbolize their right to do so. Once they knew of their freedom, Lee Guyton recollected,
a heap of people say they was going to name themselves over. They named themselves big names. Some of the names was Abraham, and some called themselves Lincoln. Any big name except in their master's name. It was the fashion.
Lee Guyton's father decided to be the exception. He kept the name of his master because
fine folks raise us and we gonna hold to our own names.
That was his reason. From his view, he had good masters, and what better way to honor them than to take on their name? You see? In adopting surnames, as in other manifestations of their new freedom, the ex-slaves defied any easy categorization. If, for a variety of reasons, some took the names of old or recent masters, many openly repudiated such names.
That's my old rebel master's title.
A young South Carolina black protested after he used the name of Middleton in a freedmen's school.
Him's nothing to me now. I don't belong to he no longer, and I don't see no use in being called for him.
There we go. Don't call him that name. He already told you he doesn't want to be called that. While enrolling a freedman in the Union Army, a recruiting officer in Tennessee demanded that he take a surname and suggested that of his previous master. The proposal struck the young black man with obvious dismay.
No, sir.
He replied emphatically.
I's had enough of old massa.
That's right. That freedmen should have assumed the surnames of prominent white families might have flattered the patriarchal ego and self-image of the planter class, but it also left some whites in utter dismay, and few of them had any notion of the considerations that entered into such decisions.
I used to be proud of my name.
Caroline Ravenel wrote a close friend.
I have ceased to be so. I fear it will no longer be spotless, as the two meanest Negroes on the place have appropriated it.
Name is about reputation. So when someone mentions your name, there are a group of ideas associated with you that unfold in that moment. And that's your reputation, at least in the observer's mind. She wasn't proud of her name anymore. Why? Because she believed the Ravenel reputation was tarnished now that the two worst Negroes on the place had attached themselves to it. So the things that they did would unfold in these ideas when someone hears the name Ravenel. That's how she's looking at this. Eliza Frances Andrews, the daughter of a prominent Georgian, expressed some amusement over the names taken by the family's former slaves, but she also proved to be far more perceptive than most whites. In the Andrews household, the family servant, Charity, announced on her wedding day that she had two names, like her white folks. She would henceforth be addressed as Mrs. Tatum, while her husband, Hamp, a field hand, would now be known as Mr. Sam Ampy Tatum. Trying to keep a straight face, Eliza Andrews asked her how they had come by the name of Tatum.
His grandfather used to belong to a Mr. Tatum,
she replied.
So he took his name for his entitles.
The blacks,
seldom or never,
adopted the names of their most recent owners, Miss Andrews observed. Almost always they would take the name of some former master.
And they go as far back as possible.
After all, she surmised,
it was the name of the actual owner that distinguished them in slavery, and I suppose they wish to throw off that badge of servitude. Then, too, they have their notions of family pride.
But even as these changes both amused and impressed her, Eliza Andrews had to confess to herself that they were not altogether pleasing.
All these changes are very sad to me, in spite of their comic side. There will soon be no more old mammies and daddies, no more old uncles and aunties. Instead of Mom Judy and Uncle Jacob, we shall have our Mrs. Ampy Tatums and our Mr. Lewis Williamses. The sweet ties that bound our old family servants to us will be broken and replaced with envy and ill will.
That chipped away at the system of white supremacy. And for her, the good old days had disappeared and a new reality had set in. And part of that reality was that Negroes had the ability to fully name themselves, right? And so with that being said, we continue to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.